Hey Sarah, uh,
Hi,
how you doing today?
I'm good. How are
I'm
you?
doing great, doing great. So Sarah, you grew up in Washington D.C., known by many as the Swamp, right? I mean the
Yes.
Washington D.C. with politics and everything. Your
Yes.
father, Gary Bauer, he ran for president in 2000.
hmm
You've definitely had some exposure to politics and how it works in the family dynamic.
Yeah.
I
Yes.
love hearing the story behind the work that someone has created, and you've written a
Yeah.
book kind of about this that's called The Space Between Us.
Mhm.
And so tell me, was there an event or something that led to you wanting to write this book?
Yeah, well, I think I probably was like a lot of people and noticed in the past couple of years that the dialogue around politics was getting more and more toxic and it wasn't improving. And I didn't consider myself an expert in politics by any stretch of the imagination, but having come from a political family, my dad having the experience that he had, and my brother and my sister both went into politics, have worked for congressmen, senators, governors, vice presidents, State Department. I'm like in it. But I thought, gosh, maybe someone else is more equipped to write this. But I thought our politicians aren't really leading out in this conversation. So maybe it needs to be someone, just any citizen really, that can take this conversation and begin to lead out in it and set an example. And so I thought, why not me? Why not any human that wants to talk in a more humane way to people? Any of us can do that. And I'm a mom. I have an 8-year old and I have a 10-year old. And the last presidential election, I could tell that they were just starting to be much more aware of the conversations happening on news stations, around the dinner table, noticing signs and bumper stickers. And I thought, this is a problem. I don't want them to think that politics has to be this way. But even if I'm just acknowledging the problem, I'm complicit in it if I'm not doing anything to help solve it. And so I just thought, why not bring my experience and just what I've learned from my own family and see if that could be helpful to other people.
That's great, and the book is fantastic. You know, we are in an election year, as you know, and so election years in the United States are obviously always very tense.
Yes.
For you, your dad, he ran for president. You're the
Yeah.
daughter. You've gone through that. What is it like being the daughter of somebody running for a high office?
Yeah. The short answer was I was not a fan, but that was probably because I was a senior in high school and I thought everything should have been about me at that point. And that obviously, when your dad runs for president, that changes things a little bit. But the experience itself, we had a lot of great memories that came from that, traveling around the country and going to presidential debates. And, we got to go to the Iowa State Fair and see a life-sized sculpture of the Last Supper made out of butter. I mean, you can't, where else are you going to do that? Like, that's amazing. But the actual political side was very challenging, I would say, and for a couple of different reasons. The first one is in primary season, we've seen this with the Democrats this year, and we saw it with the Democrats and Republicans last election. The conflict is really in house. It's Republicans against Republicans and Democrats against Democrats
Mm.
until convention time, and then everybody's on the same team again. But it was very difficult to feel like you grew up hearing that the bad guys were the other side, but then during primary season, the bad guy is someone else who's supposed to be on your team. And so it really quickly made adversaries out of friends or people that you normally would consider like-minded in a lot of ways. And it created such a divisive and kind of toxic environment in that way where you felt like, gosh, I thought, and under any other circumstances, we'd be with each other. But right now we're not, we're fighting against each other. So that was hard. The other side of it is that you really realize how little control you have over the narrative being told about you and your
Mm.
family. And, for most of my life, my dad was involved in politics and in the Reagan administration, had, chief domestic policy advisor to the president. He was on the fringes of politics. We got all the perks, but none of the disadvantages. And then when he was running, he was in the spotlight enough where you just
Wow.
realized you have very little control over what's being said about you or this one particular soundbite that's being used or one picture that's being used. And I kept thinking as he was growing in familiarity to the public, the feeling of being not known was growing as a family, that you didn't actually know who we were. You didn't know what made us a family or what my dad was like or the teams he cheered for or those kinds of things that make a person a person. And so it
Sure.
really kind of made you feel that you were starting to become a two-dimensional image of a person more than a human being. And that that stayed with me. I try to remember that, in every election season, that it is so easy to make someone the sum of their political decisions. But instead, there's a human being behind them. They go home to families at night. They come from families. They were kids once with childhood dreams and fears. And remembering that very holistic image, I think, helps us preserve the humanity.
That's interesting because they're still a family, they're still human after the election.
That's
And
right.
that's got to be something interesting to go through where you have this narrative being spoken about you. Then the election happens, everybody else snaps back, but you still have to process as
That's
a
right.
family, hey,
Yeah.
that wasn't my narrative, or,
Yes.
all of that
Yeah.
stuff. That's got to be an interesting thing.
And the internet lives forever, right? Everything that's said and done, you can still find. I'm sure out there somewhere, there's a SNL clip of my dad falling off the stage that with impersonated him, and I'm like, that doesn't go away. That's still there. So you have to live with that.
Do you ever show that to him on like Christmas or holidays?
Just for fun, gather around the computer.
Lives forever. I know that my
That's
family does that to me. So,
Yeah. Right.
all right. Hey, Sarah, you write in your book how though you disagree on different issues with your family, you still can work to have a good, healthy relationship with them. What are some key things that you've learned that help you to do that well?
Yeah, well, I would say, that my relationship with my family probably is like a lot of people's, that we're very close in a lot of ways, but then as each of our, my brother and sister and I kind of grew up and had different experiences, we don't always land on the same page anymore. And so we've had to navigate how to still be civil in our treatment of one another. And one of the things that we try to do is just remember we were family first. The things that connected us to each other are always going to be true, regardless of our political positions. And I think one of the things that we've seen in our country recently is this idea that if we're having a relationship with someone, if we stay in relationship with someone, it means that we endorse everything about that person, that we condone every behavior, every choice that they've made. And so we pull back. We think, I don't want my association with you to communicate that I support you or the decisions that you're making or where you land or how you're voting. And so we pull away. And I just think, as Christians especially, that this is such a dangerous mentality, because when we look at Jesus, that was the exact opposite. He put his reputation on the line to hang out with people whose decisions he wasn't necessarily supporting, but he knew the power of presence. And before we celebrate as Christians, Jesus's death and resurrection, we celebrate Christmas, which is God with us, God in our presence, supporting us, being with us, because there's power and there's ministry and presence. So I feel like my family has done a great job at really circling around that idea of the ministry of presence, that we are not going to sacrifice connection over different beliefs, and we are not going to allow the tensions we may feel to determine how we treat each other. On a very practical level, also, we don't attend every argument we're invited to. So there are definitely things that we have conflict over, and we each have kind of made a decision, what are the things worth engaging on and what isn't. And if I'm engaging it, is it thoughtful conversation or is this a debate? Because thoughtful conversation, I'll do that all day long. I want to learn. I want to hear what somebody's thinking. But if this is about who's just the quickest with their tongue, I'm not interested in doing that, because I'll lose every time. So I would rather just have a thoughtful conversation.
What are maybe some key warning signs that you're not managing tension well when it comes to talking about these things?
Yeah. I think when emotions start getting involved, and I feel like a physical reaction, literally I start to get hot or sweaty palms, that kind of thing. And if I start to feel like I've already started to work on a rebuttal to what somebody is saying, I've stopped listening. And it's more about how I'm going to come back with something as opposed to understanding. And so I think when we head into even a debate with the objective of trying to understand somebody, that's totally different. That's a different posture than trying to go into a debate trying to win someone over.
Yeah. All the different issues happening right now in our political climate. I don't know if I'm 41 years old. I don't know if I've seen it as hot as it is right now, from issues like, obviously, the coronavirus. You've got things like pro-life, always been an issue, pro-life, pro-choice, political, racial injustice, racial justice, all these different things that happen. The list goes on, immigration. What can we do to remain true to our convictions, but yet at the same time preserve our relationships?
Yeah. I think that that's a great question. I think that's the tension that everybody's feeling, right? That our convictions matter to us. I think the problem is that we have made every belief that we had a hill to die on, and I think that we've engaged in every argument that we see happening around us instead of deciding these are the things that really matter to me and I'm not going to give up on that. But also we've got to start to see people as more than the sum of their political decisions, right? So even if you vote differently than me, that's not who you are as a human being. As a human being, you're still representative of God's image. You have something inside of you that I wouldn't engage or I wouldn't encounter in somebody else. So I should be leaning towards that because ultimately you're an expression of God that I can learn from. So I think when we start to pull away, we're starting to send the message that I'm not curious anymore. I have nothing else to learn from you. I have it figured out. But continuing to stay in relationship is saying, maybe there's something I don't quite understand about you or about God or about your interaction with the world. And maybe I can learn from you in that. So it's really a posture of humility and curiosity that we really want to lean in as Christians.
Yeah, it's interesting. I think a lot of people approach politics from kind of the opposite standpoint of more of like I have the right worldview,
Yes.
so I need to convince you that I'm right. In your
Right.
book, you write like being right versus treating
Mhm.
people rightly.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
kind of have referred to it in my life as like being right. There's being right and there's being dead right. In the process, you kill relationships.
Yeah.
Talk
Yeah.
about that a little bit. What does it mean to treat people rightly and still, you
Yeah.
know, that tension between right and treating people rightly?
Yeah, well, I think you nailed it when you said our worldview really impacts us because I don't think we've ever lived in a time where we've been able to find information to support what we already think more easily than we do right now. So we can turn into the news channel that's going to tell us the narrative that we
Yeah.
already believe. It's going to interpret the events that we want interpreting the way we want them interpreted. We are products or victims of the algorithms of the things that we click on, the social media that we ingest, and the things that we comment on. And so we have created these echo chambers and these silos that we live in. And we've been convinced that we're completely objective because we're watching a news network or because
Yeah.
we're reading an article about something without understanding that everything is being communicated with an implicit bias.
Mm.
So I think when we understand that we are products of these things and just being aware of that, I think we can start to approach people saying, you're coming with your own worldview and you're reading separate articles or you're watching a different news network. So we've got to figure out where does the truth lie in between the two of us? Because when we start to think that we're the only ones that have cornered the market and on the most objective way to see the world, then we automatically are going to come across as self-righteous and condescending and demeaning towards people. But
Wow.
treating people rightly is saying, I see that God's image is in you. I see that in you, and you have something that I can learn from. I haven't cornered the market on God. God is not explicitly on my side, team me, whatever party that is,
Yeah.
but you have something to share to me. And I think it's that curiosity, it's that willingness to want to learn instead of to shame or to convince that is just going to really preserve our relationships now and after the election, because I think it's going to need to work there too.
That is fascinating stuff. I mean, just to think that, because I think you're right. Like people live in their own world in the
Yeah.
sense of social media. They're seeing their algorithm. So they're in their mind, psychologically, they've built this narrative
Yeah.
that 80% of the world thinks like I think, and
Yeah.
the other 20% are all crazy,
Right.
because
That's right.
you see just enough that you think everybody else, that you're in the majority, they're in the minority.
That's
But
right.
in reality, that's just our worldview, just based on the digital world we live in. That's
Yeah.
just really fascinating stuff
Yeah.
right there. One of the ideas that you talk about in your book is how we build walls to isolate ourselves from people who may not believe what we believe, but that building walls comes with a cost. What is that cost?
Yeah. Well, the story I tell in the book is a trip my husband and I took to Northern Ireland. And about 30 years ago, well, it started probably 60 years ago, there were the Troubles where Northern Ireland was deciding whether they're going to be part of the United Kingdom or part of the Republic of Ireland. And there was a lot of tension and political violence in Northern Ireland deciding what they were going to do. And so they literally built walls in the city of Belfast mostly, but in some surrounding areas that were separating neighborhoods where different sides were living to try to keep the violence from erupting. But they built these walls at the very beginning of the conflict, and then the conflict lasted another 30 years with bombings and violence in the streets. And so it didn't solve the problem. And in fact, I think it probably created a bigger problem, because when we build walls with people, we lack the human engagement. When we're not seeing somebody eye to eye, we're able to make them into something so other that we can't understand or appreciate, because there's no communication with them. And so, we've seen these studies about, prolonged eye contact with people, how it literally triggers empathy and a sense of understanding in us. But when we are shut out of another person's world, think of it's the exact opposite. We're shutting down our empathetic centers and instead turning it into almost a subhuman creature, right? We don't
Wow.
understand them. They're not even human anymore in how we treat them and how we see them. And obviously a dehumanization in our treatment of people is not a good thing. So, it's interesting. You go to Belfast, there's a lot of walls still up. I think they're starting to take some of them down, but it just is such a reminder of what can happen when we allow our differences to be something that we don't engage with because we think it's safer. We think it'll keep us safe by refusing engagement, when ultimately it's harder work to engage, but it keeps us human. It keeps both sides human in our treatment of one another.
Wow. I think that's important, like to see the humanity in
Yeah.
each person. I think, we live in a society where it feels like any political issue might be taboo. I don't know if you
Yeah.
like I mean, it used to be where you could express what political aisle you meet, but right now I think there are people don't want to say who they voted for. They don't want
Yeah.
to, and it makes us maybe more internal. And those
Yeah.
walls come up
Yeah.
like, hey, I'll vote for who I want. I'll keep that internal. And I think, what are some ways that you approach people with politics? Do you wait for them to bring it up, or do you?
Yeah, I mean, sometimes I'll bring it up, kind of test the waters a little bit and
Yeah.
see how it goes that way. But I think it's interesting. I don't think it was always this way, but I think that we started to think that you didn't talk about politics or religion in polite company, so we stopped talking about it. And I feel like civil conversation is a muscle. It atrophies if you don't use it. And so we've gotten so used to not talking about it, so that when we do, it's not like riding a bike. We forgot and we're not doing it well. So I think that, it's good to kind of test the waters, to try to be as nuanced as possible in talking about it. But I think, again, I think it goes back to remembering the more holistic view of a person more than just their politics. In the
Mhm.
1990s, it used to be that when congressmen and senators were elected to Congress and the Senate, they moved their entire families to DC. And so you would be having congressmen and senators, working on different sides of the aisle during the week, but on the weekends there'd be barbecues for all the families, and their kids
Wow.
would play on soccer teams together. And so there was this sense that, yeah, we'd fight during the week, but on the weekends we'd hang out together. Well, in the 1990s that changed, and congressmen and senators started just moving to Washington themselves Monday through Friday, and then flying back home to their families. And so it really kind of created this dynamic where the politicians were only seen as politicians during the week. There was no interaction with each other's families to see this other side of them. And so I think when we only talk about politics, we run into that problem too. We're only seeing
That's
the
great.
political side of people. But when we have relationships with people that are more well-rounded and then more holistic, then politics doesn't have to be dangerous, because we know what makes this person who they are. It's not just who they vote for on the first Tuesday of November. It's, what their kids are like, what they do for a living, the things that they get excited about, the things that they're passionate about, and their purpose and their calling. We see there's so much more to them. And so I think we need to take a page from 1990s Washington and start to see ourselves as more well-rounded, holistic people.
That's great. That's great. So how often then do you watch the news a week?
These days, not very often.
It's good. That's good.
I try to stay informed, but I think it's important, for all of us to pay attention to emotional health, mental well-being. Sometimes it's just not helpful to watch some of it, but being informed matters. Participating in the civic process matters. I think that's important.
I
I think
agree.
we just need to remember that being informed and voting, that is the least that is required of us. The most that's required of us is engaging with the people after election day.
Yeah. I was watching the news one night, and my oldest daughter, she's 16. We were
Mm.
watching a certain segment, and we were getting riled up. I was getting riled up. And and because sometimes you invest your emotions, right? I remember my daughter goes, oh, this person is just a, he's
Mhm.
a moron or something. I remember
Yeah.
looking at her going, whoa. And I was thinking then in your book, you talk about like our political viewpoint has a lot of times been developed from some sort of personal thing,
Yeah.
and so our kids watch that, they get
Mhm.
emotionally invested. I remember thinking like my daughter didn't even know half of how government operates, but she's developed
Right.
this worldview already with passion.
Right.
So I think limiting, we've chosen to limit a lot of those things, get
Yeah.
the issues, find out the issues, and really try to research it from
Yeah.
a
Yeah.
good balanced standpoint.
I think it's important to remember too, the news is a business, right? And so they are making money off of our watching, and we watch the things that drive our emotions, that are the
It's
most
true.
entertaining. And so I think we need to remember that we are, we're investing our time and our money into something that we're watching. And so it's in their best interest to get us to keep watching and to get us emotional and to not get us to turn it off. So keeping that in mind, I think helps us, this it's not a completely unbiased form of news all the
Well,
time.
I think this is great stuff, especially for people now. The book is The Space Between Us. Where can people find this book if they were to look?
Yeah, it's on barnesandnoble.com and amazon.com. So you can find it both those
It's
places.
awesome. Sarah,
Thank
thank you so much for taking the time, talking with us, and having this discussion.
Yes, thank you for having me.
Appreciate it.
Thanks.